In 1836, a photograph of 5 sisters was taken, and nearly 2 centuries later, experts were stunned after a closer examination.
Photographs may feel commonplace today, easily snapped and forgotten, but in their earliest days, they were nothing short of revolutionary. They reshaped memory, redefined evidence, and forever changed how people saw themselves and the world around them. In dusty albums, beneath tarnished silver surfaces, or hidden behind layers of time and technology, many frozen images have waited for curious minds to look again, more closely, more critically. In one particular case, experts discovered an old photograph from the 19th century and instantly turned pale when they zoomed in. Let's take a walk through history with photographs. The Sandyford Murder case. Back in July 1862, a 35-year-old servant, Jessie McPherson, who worked in the basement flat at 17 Sandyford Place near Charing Cross, was discovered brutally slaughtered. Her body lay half-naked in a pool of blood, having sustained more than 40 wounds inflicted by a meat cleaver. Police traced missing silverware from the Fleming household to a pawnbroker, launching an inquiry that ultimately tangled together servant Jessica McLaughlin and the Fleming patriarch, James Fleming, in a web of crime and suspicion. This scandalous case unfolded in Glasgow's notorious Square Mile of Murder. Most notably, it became the first Scottish homicide to employ forensic photography. Detectives photographed the crime scene, capturing blood-spattered flooring, bloody footprints, and meticulously detailed lithographs of the maltreatment, with plans made by Charles O'Neill and architect McClure and MacDonald. These visual records preserved spatial evidence that conventional testimony alone might not convey. More profoundly, this was also the debut case for Glasgow's new detective branch. You see, in the early days of July, while the Fleming family, including eldest son John and his wife, holidayed in Dunoon, McPherson remained in the house with her employer's 87-year-old father. On July 7th, John returned to find the patriarch claiming not to have seen his servant since Friday. Only on unlocking the basement door did they discover McPherson's body. Suspicion first fell on old Fleming due to blood-stained shirts found in his room and rumors of prior impropriety with female servants. However, attention soon turned to Jessie McLaughlin, McPherson's closest friend and a former servant in the household. Police learned that McLaughlin, 28, and mother to a 3-year-old, had pawned several pieces of silverware sent to her by McPherson. The pawnbroker identified her as the seller, who had received around £17, which would be equivalent to roughly £900 today. Subsequent searches of her Glasgow home uncovered blood-stained clothing, including McPherson's coat. The most sensational piece of evidence was a photograph of a bloody footprint taken at the crime scene, which detectives matched by having McLaughlin step into a bucket of cow's blood and onto a plank, to the footprint in the photograph. They claimed it was a perfect match. At the Glasgow Circuit Court in mid-September 1862, the prosecution mounted a formidable case. The photographic evidence, including that of footprints, floor plans, and crime scene images, was central to their argument. Witnesses described hearing cries at around 4 in the morning, and detailed testimony was given about McLaughlin's repeated, inconsistent statements. Over 4 days, jury deliberation lasted less than 20 minutes before a unanimous guilty verdict was delivered. The judge, Lord Dias, condemned McLaughlin's final statement as a tissue of wicked falsehoods and pronounced a death sentence to be carried out on October 11, 1862. Public reaction was immediate and fierce. Glasgow was polarized between those who believed in McLaughlin's conviction and others convinced of her innocence. Newspapers saw a 5-fold increase in circulation, and pamphlets and petitions poured into officials. In an unprecedented move, the Home Secretary, Sir George Grey, appointed a court commission led by Lord Young to re-examine the case in secret. Though the commission did not exonerate McLaughlin, It did commute her sentence to life transportation, citing serious doubts about the evidence, especially regarding the footprints and the alleged motive of Old Fleming in refusing McPherson's advances. McLaughlin served 15 years in Perth General Prison before her release on ticket of leave in October 1877. She emigrated to Port Huron, Michigan, where she remarried and lived until her death on January 1, 1899. Meanwhile, James Fleming died in September 1864 at the age of 90, still unable to fully clear his name in the public eye. In any case, the match between photographed footprints and McLaughlin's was among the earliest documented uses of forensic photography in a homicide trial. These developments contributed significantly to the practices that would evolve into modern forensic procedures, such as crime scene documentation, footprint analysis, and photographic archiving in legal contexts. But wait, there's a lot more from where that came. The Lincoln conspirators' photograph. In the sweltering heat of a July afternoon in 1865, 4 condemned conspirators stood on a hastily constructed gallows in the courtyard of Fort McNair, formerly the Washington Arsenal, in southwest Washington, D.C. Their crimes, the kidnapping plot, turned assassination of President Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, had sparked national outrage. Among them was Mary Elizabeth Surratt, whose boarding house at 604 H Street, Nuptaler, had been the conspiracy's planning hub. She stood alongside Lewis Powell, who stabbed Secretary Seward, David Harold, the getaway aide, and George Atzerodt, who was assigned to kill Vice President Johnson. The photograph taken by Alexander Gardner, an associate of Matthew Brady, captured the condemned on the scaffold at approximately 1 p.m. 10 images in total documented the proceedings, making this among the earliest examples of photojournalism in America. One photograph shows Mary Surratt, draped in black alpaca and a dark veil, seated with a priest ministering to her, her arms and legs bound, though her daughter Anna's visible distress echoed throughout the prison courtyard. A second notable image shows soldiers adjusting the nooses, while a hush falls over the assembled government officials and invited spectators, numbering over 1,000, some of whom were press with exclusive tickets to view the execution. At the July 7, 1865 execution, Gardner positioned his large-format cameras approximately 100 feet from the gallows on a prison wall, using both glass plate negatives and stereoscopes to harness the powerful combination of clarity and perspective. The choice of vantage point, overlooking the gallows and descending scaffolding, drew viewers directly into the scene's emotional intensity. Despite its dramatic power, the sale of these images met with limited commercial success, as public appetite for such macabre realism waned even as the nation struggled to reconstruct after the Civil War. Over the ensuing decades, historians have returned to these photographs, looking at them as visual evidence aiding in ongoing debates about the conspirators, especially Mary Surratt. Though convicted by a military tribunal on June 30th, she was the first woman executed by the federal government, raising complex questions about gender, due process, and evidentiary standards. Critics point to the hasty 7-week trial, the use of secret witness testimonies, and the military tribunal instead of a civil court. While the tribunal's guilty verdict was pronounced with a simple majority, the death sentence required a 2/3 vote. This raises questions about the judicial process under a national crisis. Further historical reanalysis through legal scholarship, exhibitions like The Assassin's Accomplice, and modern biographical studies has probed Mary Surratt's true level of involvement. Some argue the evidence implicating her was circumstantial, which was the delivery of a package from Booth and ownership of the boarding house where conspirators met. Significantly, John M. Lloyd, the tavern keeper, testified she told him to have shooting irons ready. Yet others note that 5 of the 9 tribunal judges petitioned President Andrew Johnson for clemency on the grounds of her age and gender. Photographs of the execution later featured in landmark exhibitions, including those at the Library of Congress and Indiana Historical Society, prompting renewed attention to how photography can bear witness to state power, collective sentiment, and questions of historical memory. Scholars like James Swanson and Daniel Weinberg identified the sequence as perhaps the most striking in early photojournalism, a turning point in how Americans would consume images of crime and punishment. But not all photos captured legal proceedings. Some were a bit paranormal. Spirit photography and William Mumbler. In the turbulent aftermath of the American Civil War, the United States found itself mourning more than 600,000 dead, the vast majority of them young men lost on battlefields or to illness. The war's emotional devastation rippled through homes from Pennsylvania to Georgia, hollowing out families and leaving unanswered questions and untold grief. Into this aching cultural landscape came spiritualism, a movement that had already been gaining ground since the 1840s with the famous Fox sisters in New York. It found fertile new life in post-war America, offering grieving families a fragile promise that death was not the end, and that communication with the departed could be achieved through mediums, seances, and increasingly, photography. This was the world into which William H. Mumbler emerged. Born in 1832 in Boston, Massachusetts, Mumbler began his professional life as a jewelry engraver. But in the early 1860s, like many curious artisans of his day, he began experimenting with the collodion wet plate photographic process, an emerging technique involving glass negatives and chemical development. In October 1862, during one such amateur experiment, Mumbler developed a self-portrait and noticed something that shocked him. There was a second, faint figure hovering beside him. He believed it to be the image of his deceased cousin, who had died 12 years earlier. He submitted the image to the Herald of Progress, a spiritualist newspaper, on November 1, 1862, and left his engraving work behind to become what would be known as the world's first spirit photographer. Within months, his photography studio in Boston, later in New York City, was attracting large numbers of bereaved clients, hoping for a last glimpse of a loved one. He charged between $5 and $10 per photograph, a hefty sum at the time, equivalent to $150 to $300 today, for a single carte de visite depicting the living sitter accompanied by a semi-transparent, spectral spirit. These images were ethereal and ghostly, often with the spirit hovering behind or above the seated subject. One of the most sensational sessions occurred in February 1872 when Mary Todd Lincoln, the widow of President Abraham Lincoln, visited Mumbler's studio under the pseudonym Mrs. Tyndall. The resulting image depicted her seated with what was claimed to be Abraham Lincoln's ghost standing behind her. The image was circulated widely. By the mid-1860s, Mumbler had established himself as a go-to figure for grieving clients. Among his sitters were high-profile individuals, including abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison and spiritualist lecturers like Emma Harding Britten. All this attention earned Mumbler both admiration and suspicion. Photographic experts began questioning his techniques, and traditional portrait photographers accused him of trickery and deceit. While Mumbler claimed that the spirits appeared spontaneously and unbidden, his critics noted patterns, recurring spirits bearing resemblance to living people, reused poses, and similar compositions. He defended his work in pamphlets and interviews, insisting that he had no control over what manifested on the plate. However, by the late 1860s, the practice of spirit photography itself came under intense scrutiny, and Mumbler's methods were no exception. Though the exact techniques he used were never publicly confirmed by him, photography experts of the time were well aware of how multiple exposures could be used to superimpose a secondary image onto the primary portrait. Among the most common methods suspected were the reuse of photographic plates without proper cleaning, thereby leaving ghostly residual images from previous exposures, or purposefully exposing a fresh plate twice, once with the sitter and again with a posed figure meant to represent the spirit. Critics also noted inconsistencies in lighting and focus in many of the spirit images, strongly suggesting manipulation. Sometimes the spirits were disproportionately large or appeared to float unnaturally behind the living subjects. In other instances, figures bore striking resemblance to models seen in earlier portraits. Perhaps most damning was the discovery that some spirits appeared in the photographs of multiple unrelated clients. One such spirit was found to resemble a widely available engraving of a celebrity who had no connection to the sitter. Fellow photographers such as James Black and Abraham Bogardus, both prominent figures in New York's photographic community, dissected Mumbler's output and demonstrated how such effects could be recreated in controlled studio environments using simple props, multiple negatives, and long exposure times. By 1869, the skepticism reached a boiling point. Under increasing pressure from both photographers and public authorities, Mumbler was arrested in New York City and charged with fraud and larceny. The high-profile case drew national attention, not least because the prosecution enlisted none other than P.T. Barnum, the famed showman and founder of the American Museum, as a star witness. Barnum, already known for his manufactured curiosities and staged illusions, claimed that Mumbler's photographs were emotionally exploitative frauds, taking advantage of Civil War widows and grieving families. In a calculated counter-demonstration, Barnum commissioned photographer Abraham Bogardus to create a spirit photograph of himself, posing with the ghost of Abraham Lincoln, proving how easily such images could be manufactured. The trial began in April 1869 and lasted 7 days. Held at the Tombs Police Court in Manhattan, the hearing was presided over by Judge John Dowling. A parade of witnesses testified for both sides. The prosecution argued that Mumbler's studio was a stage, and his so-called spirits were mere darkroom illusions. They even alleged that he and his associates had broken into clients' homes to steal photographs of deceased family members, later reusing them to fabricate the ghostly apparitions. Several clients testified that the spirits in their portraits closely resembled photographs they had previously owned. The defense, in turn, called supporters from the spiritualist community, including journalist Moses A. Dow, who claimed to have seen images develop in real time under conditions that ruled out tampering. Yet, no witness could definitively prove that Mumbler had physically manipulated the camera or negatives during the session. Judge Dowling concluded that although the evidence was suspicious and Mumbler's methods questionable, the prosecution had failed to meet the threshold of proof necessary for a conviction. On April 23, 1869, Mumbler was acquitted. Though Mumbler walked free, the trial dealt a severe blow to his reputation. His studio clientele in New York vanished, and he returned to Boston, opening a small photography business far removed from his earlier notoriety. Spirit photography, however, did not die with the verdict. Instead, it found new champions, particularly in England, where spiritualism continued to flourish through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Chief among Mumbler's successors was Frederick A. Hudson, a London-based photographer active in the 1870s who openly practiced spirit photography. Hudson attracted the attention of many in the British spiritualist movement, most notably Sir William Crookes, a Fellow of the Royal Society and a leading chemist and physicist. Crookes conducted experiments with spiritualist mediums and claimed to observe phenomena that defied scientific explanation. Perhaps the most influential figure to take up Mumbler's mantle was William Hope, an English spirit photographer active from the early 1900s into the 1920s. Based in Crewe, Hope founded the so-called Crewe Circle, a group of spiritualists who produced spirit photographs and claimed to operate under strict ethical and metaphysical conditions. Hope gained wide popularity, even attracting the support of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes and a devout spiritualist. However, hope too was eventually discredited. In 1922, magician and escapologist Harry Houdini, a leading critic of fraudulent spiritualist practices, collaborated with researchers at the Society for Psychical Research and the British journal The Strand to expose the photographic manipulations. Psychical researcher Harry Price famously set a trap by giving Hope photographic plates secretly marked with X-rays. When Hope returned the plates with spirit images, Price revealed that the original plates had never been used, proving unequivocally that the photographs were staged. Yet, despite these exposures, spirit photography remained popular in some circles until well into the 1930s, particularly in wartime contexts where bereaved families sought solace. But as photography became more understood by the general public, the illusion of spectral authenticity grew increasingly fragile. William Mumbler, the man who had launched a global spiritualist visual movement, died on May 16, 1884 in Boston, Massachusetts, at the age of 52. Though he had largely retreated from the public eye in his final years, he remained involved in photographic innovation. In the 1870s, Mumbler developed what he referred to as the Mumbler process, an early form of photoelectrotyping that enabled mass printing of photographic images in newspapers and journals. His obituary appeared in the Photographic Times and American Photographer, which recognized Mumbler not as a fraud, but as a creative contributor to photographic experimentation. Let us walk back to the realm of living for this next one: Black Civil War soldiers in family albums. During the Civil War era, African American soldiers often went unrecognized in mainstream history, but their contributions should not be ignored. Today, we can truly appreciate their contributions through visual evidence. A miniature leather-bound album of Captain William A. Prickett, held by his descendants and now housed at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, contains 4 albumin prints and 14 tintypes depicting members of Company G, 25th Regiment, United States Colored Troops, or USCT, each labeled with names and ranks. This is an extraordinary survival of personal identities from a time when many black soldiers were documented anonymously. It provides a rare window into a segregated army where approximately 200,000 black men served under white officers, enduring disease and prejudice while fighting for freedom. The earliest of these portraits dates from 1863 to 1860, around the creation of the Bureau of Colored Troops by War Secretary Edwin Stanton in May 1863. One tintype image taken near military camps, possibly at Benton Barracks in St. Louis, shows a Union soldier standing before a painted backdrop with a rifle and revolver, the American flag subtly included. Another ambrotype features a soldier seated with 2 small children. Each meticulously inscribed photograph connects a uniformed individual to history, enabling genealogists and museums to trace identities and descendants, a process that has already yielded living relatives such as those of James Tall, a former enslaved teenager turned soldier. These deeply personal photographs combine visual evidence such as uniform styles, keepees, insignia, and rifles, with oral family histories and written records corroborating generational narratives. Such images allowed black soldiers to assert self-authored identities. Institutionally, the Library of Congress's Liljenquist Family Collection, gifted in 2010, further expanded the archive by adding over 7,000 ambrotypes and tintypes of Civil War soldiers, both Union and Confederate, including many previously unidentified African American servicemen. The acquisition fostered new scholarly projects, such as Civil War-focused story maps and educational frameworks, by providing visual materials to study uniform details, military gear, and personal narratives. The William A. Gladstone Collection contributes nearly 350 historical images featuring African Americans, including black officers of the USCT, augmenting portrait diversity and depth. These recovered family archives have recalibrated public memory, CNN reports that around 180,000 African American soldiers joined the Union Army and roughly 40,000 perished, three-quarters from disease rather than combat, highlighting sacrifices rarely visualized before. The presence of names and faces transforms abstract metrics into individual legacies, bridging the gap between collective history and personal memory. Curators at the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress emphasize how photographic evidence has altered nationalist narratives. Michelle Gates Moresi, a Smithsonian curator, described the Prickett album as a rare instance of original photographs of African American soldiers whose identity is documented. These photographs affirm that, far from mere footnotes, African American soldiers fought for emancipation and citizenship, leaving behind visual evidence that transcends the faded written record. But wait, we're not done just yet. The Summerton Man. On the misty morning of 1st December 1948, two trainee jockeys discovered a lifeless man slumped against a seawall on Summerton Beach, Adelaide, South Australia, around 6:30 a.m. Dressed in a dark suit, tie, and polished shoes, he lay with his legs crossed and a cigarette still burning on his coat collar. What made the discovery particularly eerie were the missing labels on his clothing, lack of identification, and inexplicable items in his pockets. Bus and train tickets, one unused, juicy fruit gum, two combs from the U.S., and a torn scrap of paper bearing the Persian phrase "tamam shud," meaning "it is finished." That scrap was later traced to a 1941 edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The autopsy, conducted by city pathologist Dr. John Dwyer, found no obvious signs of trauma, yet the man's internal organs, liver, lungs, and spleen, were congested, and stomach contents included partially digested pasty. Dwyer believed the cause was poisoning by an enigmatic fast-acting substance, undetectable with the technology of the time. This led to theories ranging from self-harm to murder, even espionage, especially since the Cold War context fueled speculation of Soviet involvement. For over 7 decades, the identity of this man, dubbed Summerton Man, remained a mystery. However, in October 2019, the South Australian Attorney General approved the exhumation of his remains. On 19th of May 2021, police recovered his body from West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide, noting it was in reasonable condition for DNA extraction. Scientists successfully extracted genetic material in 2012 from hair fragments trapped in a plastered death mask made in 1949, decoding 2 million DNA markers. In July 2022, University of Adelaide professor Derek Abbott, collaborating with American forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick, employed genealogical triangulation across over 4,000 distant relatives using online databases. They identified the Summerton Man as Carl Charles Webb, born 16 November 1905 in Footscray, Melbourne, youngest of 6 children. Webb, an electrical engineer, married Dorothy Jean Robertson in 1941. She filed for divorce in 1951. Genealogical confirmation came via a living relative in Victoria, Carl Webb's first cousin 3 times removed, who provided a DNA sample that matched the extracted profile. While South Australia police have not yet confirmed these findings, they indicated they are reviewing the evidence. Some skeptics, including retired detective Gordon Kramer, emphasized that forensic certainty would require matching dental records or personal objects, but the genetic and genealogical evidence remains compelling. Photographic materials played a key role in corroborating the identification. Professor Abbott uncovered family photos of Webb and his siblings, including his brother Roy Webb in military uniform, who tragically perished in the Second World War in 1943, and a nephew, John Russell Keane, whose name was stitched on a tie and vest found on the Summerton Man. Photographs from the Webb family album, especially an image from the 1920s showing Charles Webb with siblings, provided visual confirmation of facial structure and build. The puzzle deepened with the discovery that Webb had separated from his wife in April 1947, and that the Rubaiyat fragment and cryptic handwriting, previously thought to be coded, possibly reflected Webb's known passion for poetry and horse betting. The presence of items labeled Keene suggests he may have worn his nephew's clothing, neatly fitting, since Charles and John Keene were of similar size. In Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery, a formerly anonymous headstone now marks the resting place of a man given back his name, ending a 74-year chapter of speculations and questions, but also opening new inquiries into motives, movements, and the final days of Charles Webb's life. Rediscovered daguerreotype via synchrotron imaging. In June 2018, a collaborative team comprising researchers from Western University, the National Gallery of Canada, and the Canadian Light Source, or CLS, made a breakthrough with tarnished daguerreotypes, or fragile 19th-century silver-plated copper photographic plates once thought lost beneath corrosion. These plates, produced between the 1840s and 1850s using a mercury vapor development process invented by Louis Daguerre in 1839, often suffer irreversible surface degradation over time. The Canadian team, led by PhD candidate Madalena S. Kozachuk, under supervisor T.K. Sham of Western's Chemistry Department, utilized synchrotron-based micro-X-ray fluorescence at CLS and Cornell High-Energy Synchrotron Source, or CHESS, to detect mercury distributions embedded in the metal image particles, patterns invisible to the naked eye. Daguerreotypes are so named for their use of iodine-sensitized, highly polished silver-copper plates, often requiring multi-minute exposure times. The latent image was rendered visible by mercury vapor, which amalgamated with silver, forming the essential image particles. Over decades, these chemical deposits corroded into silver sulfide or silver chloride, obscuring the visible image. Photographs once thought irretrievable were thus assumed blank or too degraded to merit restoration until this technique demonstrated otherwise. These scientific advances have immediate implications for museums, archivists, and conservation laboratories. Many daguerreotypes have been shelved or restricted from display due to delicate conditions. Today, we can be virtually reunited with their imagery without invasive chemical or physical cleaning. Cases where cleaning might further damage or remove mercury or gold image particles can now still be documented using this non-contact technique. Institutionally, two lines of research are converging: imaging and electro-cleaning. In her PhD thesis, Kozachuk detailed how controlled cleaning, via Barger and Way electrochemical systems, reduced tarnish without erasing mercury, gold, or silver image particles. These discoveries inform best practices in sectioning cleaning versus imaging preserved content, ensuring that any future conservation is grounded in structural knowledge. Economically, CLS Director Ingrid Pickering and colleagues highlight the method's broader impact. Beyond daguerreotypes, high-resolution micro-X-ray fluorescence helps in corrosion studies of archaeological metals, fossils, and heritage textiles. This cross-disciplinary reach elevates the technique as a tool for cultural continuity. In total, an estimated several thousand daguerreotypes in Canadian and global archives may benefit from this approach. The NGC's collection alone holds over 2,700 plates, with many more in private and public holdings currently deemed too deteriorated for display. Synchrotron recovery has already reshaped our understanding of early photographic permanence. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.